The air at Devil's Tower felt off. It was cold and heavy, like something was pushing down their chest. The massive rock formation loomed over them, jagged and dark, with deep cracks running down its sides. The wind howled through those cracks like faint screams. Mason shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his backpack. I still don't get why we're doing this. It's an explorer's dream, Ava said, swinging her camera over her shoulder. People disappear here, Mason. All they ever find is their bloody gear. It's too good to pass up. Yeah, Mason muttered. Lucky us. Jarrett chuckled nervously. Come on, man, we'll be famous after this. Sam wasn't laughing. He stood a little behind the group, gripping his pocket knife like it might actually help him. I just want to get this over with. The four friends had driven 6 hours to hike Devil's Tower at night. The stories were terrifying. Hikers going missing, whispers in the wind, and shadowy figures drifting between the rocks. Relax, Ava said. We'll stay on the trail, just some cool footage, and we're out. The first few hours were quiet. The only sounds were the wind whistling through the trees and their footsteps crunching on the dirt path. But as they climbed higher, the air grew colder. The wind seemed sharper now, cutting against their skin. Then came the whispers. At first, Mason barely noticed them, soft and faint like a distant radio. He stopped walking and tilted his head. Did you hear that? Hear what? Ava asked, still focused on her camera. I thought I heard a voice. The whispers came again, a little louder this time. Help us. Lost. Please. Jared's face went pale. Okay, that was not the wind. It's just the rocks, Ava said, though she didn't sound convinced. Sound bounces weird out here. But Sam shook his head. It's not the rocks, he muttered. It's them. Them, Mason answered. Sam swallowed hard. The ones that disappear. They kept walking, but the whispers found them. The words were getting clearer. Lost. Alone. Save us. The wind seemed to curl around them now, like it was reaching out to grab hold. Mason's skin curled. The whispers weren't far anymore. They were close. Then Ava's camera flickered. The screen dimmed. The battery suddenly dying. What the hell, she muttered, slapping the side of the camera. It was fully charged. Forget the camera, Sam said tightly. We need to leave. Then Mason saw it. A shadow standing on the trail ahead. Who is that? Mason stammered. The shadow didn't move at first. It just stood there, barely visible against the rock. Then, without warning, it began to glide forward. No steps, no sound, just a slow floating motion. Run, Ava screamed. They bolted back down the trail, boots pounding against the dirt. The wind roared behind them, and the whispers turned to screams. Join us! Join us! Mason looked back. More figures were rising from the cracks in the rocks, twisted faces with black hollow eyes, their jaws hanging open like they were screaming, but no sound came from their mouths. Their skin was pale and torn, with blood streaking their faces and clothes. One of the figures jerked forward in a twisted sprint, its blackened figure reaching for them. Jarrett tripped, his body hit the dirt hard, and he gasped for air. Help! Jarrett yelled. Mason turned just in time to see one of the figures grab Jarrett's ankle. Its bony hand was covered in blackened skin, peeling away like burnt paper. Jarrett screamed as smoke rose from where the fingers touched him. Get it off! Jarrett cried. Mason grabbed Jarrett's arm and yanked him free, the creature's fingers torn away with a sickening rip, leaving a scorched black mark on Jarrett's leg. They didn't stop running until they reached the tree line. The wind had died, leaving everything horribly quiet. Are you okay? Mason gasped, helping Jarrett to his feet. I think so, Jarrett panted, but his ankle was still burning, the dark mark pulsing like something was crawling beneath his skin. Where's Ava? Sam asked suddenly. They turned, and she was gone. No, Mason whispered. No. They hurried back up the trail, shouting her name. but there was no answer. The wind had returned, soft but steady, carrying faint whispers. Lost. Gone. 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 Then Sam spotted something in the dirt. Ava's camera. He knelt down and grabbed it. The screen flickered weakly, the battery barely holding on. The footage wasn't what they expected. It showed Ava walking behind them, until she stopped. She turned slowly, staring into the shadows. Then the figures appeared, one by one, reaching out for her. Ava didn't scream. She didn't move. She just stood there, her face slack, her eyes empty. Then she was gone, dragged backward into the blackness of Devil's Tower's shadow. The video ended. "Oh my God," Sam whispered, his voice breaking. "She's still alive," Mason said, his voice shaking. "We have to go back." "No," Sam whispered. His face was pale, his hands trembling. "She's with them now." And from somewhere behind them, the wind began to whisper once more. "Join us, join us." The wind rolled across the empty plains of Casper, Wyoming, stirring the dry grass and rattling the fence posts. Out here the land stretched for miles, wide, empty, and quiet, but the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt wrong. Ethan Gray, owner of Gray Ranch, stood at the edge of his property, staring at the mess before him. Another cow was dead. Its body was torn open, ribs poking through shredded skin. Blood soaked the dirt and the bones. They were twisted into strange shapes, spirals, circles, and jagged patterns that looked too precise to be random. "This is the fifth one this month," Ethan muttered. His wife stood behind him, holding their daughter Lily close. Claire's face was pale. "You think it's wolves?" "Wolves don't do that," Ethan said, pointing at the twisted bones. Whatever was happening on his ranch wasn't natural, and whatever it was getting closer to the house. That night, Ethan stayed up late, watching the old security monitors he'd set up on the property. The screen flickered, showing the empty fields and scattered cattle. Nothing moved except the wind. But just past midnight, the screen glitched. The static buzzed, and then something appeared. A figure. A man dressed like an old cowboy stood in the field. His long coat flapped in the wind, and his wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face. But Ethan could still see his eyes, dark, empty pits. The man wasn't alone. Behind him, shadowy figures drifted through the field, their bodies thin and distorted, like smoke trying to shape. The cowboy raised his arm, motioning toward the cattle. The shadowy figures moved closer, their fingers curling like claws. The screen went black. Ethan shot out his chair, grabbed a shotgun, and raced outside. The cold air cut through him as he sprinted across the field. The cattle were restless, their cries echoing in the night. Then Ethan saw him, the Phantom Rancher. The spectral cowboy stood by the fence. His lifeless eyes looked on Ethan. His face was pale, stretched tight like dry leather, and his grin twisted unnaturally wide. "You leave my land," the Phantom growled. His voice was rough and cracked, like something speaking from the bottom of a grave. "This is my ranch," Ethan shot back, gripping his shotgun. The cowboy's grin widened, revealing blackened teeth. Not for long. Then he vanished, fading into the dark like smoke. The next morning, Ethan found 3 more cattle mutilated, their bones twisted into strange symbols once again. "Ethan," Clara whispered, standing behind him. "I've been having nightmares." "Nightmares?" Clara nodded. "I keep seeing a man in a cowboy hat standing in the corner of our room. He just stares." That night, Clara wasn't the only one plagued by nightmares. Ethan dreamed of the Phantom Rancher. In the dream, the ghostly cowboy stood at the foot of his bed, his shadow stretching across the walls. He whispered in a cold, hollow voice, "Your family, they're already mine." When Ethan woke up, there were bruises on his arm, dark handprints like someone had grabbed him in his sleep. But worst of all, Lily had scratches down her back, deep angry marks that hadn't been there the night before. Desperate for answers, Ethan went into town and visited the local historic society. After hours of digging through dusty records, he found what he was looking for, an old property deed. The Gray Ranch hadn't always been a ranch. It was once the site of a mass grave, a place where murdered settlers had been buried after a brutal conflict in the late 1800s. And among those buried was a man named Silas Boone, a rancher who refused to sell his land. His ranch was burned down, and Silas died fighting for it. But locals believe Silas never really left. They called him the Phantom Rancher. He thinks this land still belongs to him, Ethan muttered. That night, Ethan and Clara gathered what they could, sage, candles, anything they believed might drive out the spirit. They walked the land, burning the sage and whispering prayers. But as the sun set, the air grew cold, the cattle grew restless. Then the whispers started. Get off my land! The voice was low and angry like a growl on the wind. Figures began to appear, dark shapes rising from the earth, their hollow faces barely human. They twisted and swayed as they drifted closer. Then Silas appeared, the Phantom Rancher, standing right in front of Ethan, his cold eyes burning through the night. You think fine words can stop me, Silas rasped. This land is mine and I'll take what's owed. The shadowy figures lunged. Ethan grabbed Clara and Lily, dragging them toward the house. One of the figures reached for him, its cold hand burning like ice as it grabbed his arm. Ethan roared in pain and tore free, stumbling onto the porch. He turned back and saw Silas standing just feet away. You'll never stop me, Silas sneered. Not until this land is empty of the living. Ethan remembered the old records, the mass grave. Silas believed this land was still his because no one had ever properly laid those souls to rest. With no other choice, Ethan sprinted for the barn. He grabbed his shovel and began digging near the fence, right where the cattle had been dying. The earth was loose and black, and soon Ethan uncovered bones, old brittle remains, twisted with rusted buttons and bits of torn clothing. I'll finish what they started, Silas hissed, stepping closer. No, Ethan growled. He grabbed the bones and tossed them into a fire pit. Flames shot upward, and the air filled with a sickening stench. The shadowy figures let out an unearthly wail, their bodies twisting and fading like smoke in the air. Silas staggered back, his face twisted in fury. No! The flames roared higher, and with one final shriek, the Phantom Rancher disappeared. The next morning, the air felt lighter. The cattle were calm. The bruises on Ethan's arms had faded, and Lily's scratches were nearly gone. You think it's over, Clarence? Ethan stared out at the empty field where Silas once stood. The wind whispered softly through the grass, but this time it wasn't a voice, just the wind. I hope so, Ethan said. I sure hope so. But as they walked back to the house, no one noticed the faint outline of a figure standing in the distance. A man in a cowboy hat, watching. The Phantom Rancher was still out there, waiting. Winters in Jackson Hole, Wyoming are harsh. Bitter winds, deep snow, and nights so cold they seem to freeze the world solid. Locals know to stay off the back roads when the storm rolls in, not just because of the ice, but because of something far worse, something they call the frozen bride. The story starts long ago with a woman named Eleanor Reed. She was set to marry her fiancé, William Granger, a wealthy rancher from town. But on the night before their wedding, William disappeared without a trace. Some say he ran off, others say he was killed, but Eleanor believed he had changed his mind, that he had abandoned her on purpose. Heartbroken and humiliated, Eleanor put on her wedding dress and walked out into the freezing night, determined to find him. Days later, they found her frozen in the snow. Her body was twisted and stiff, Her fingers curled into claws, and her face was frozen in a horrible scream. Now when winter comes and the snow falls heavy, travelers claim to see a woman in a tattered wedding dress wandering the icy roads. Those who offer her a ride never make it home. Jake, Mia, and Eric had heard the legend before, but they didn't believe it. The three friends were visiting Jackson Hole for a ski trip, more interested in recording content for their social media than listening to ghost stories. It's just a dumb myth, Jake laughed as they sat in their cabin by the fire. People around here love to scare tourists. Tell that to the trucker they found frozen in his cab last winter, Eric added. His face was frozen, like he'd seen something awful before he died. That's just a coincidence, Mia said, hugging her mug of cocoa, but her voice wasn't as confident as she wanted it to be. Jake's grin widened. Then let's prove it's fake. Let's drive down the pass tonight and film it for TikTok. No way, Mia said. Come on, Jake teased. Are you scared? Of course not, Mia lied. And that's how they ended up on the Teton Pass Road later that night. The road was nearly invisible beneath the snow. The wind howled against the car, making the windows tremble. Jake drove while Eric filmed from the passenger seat. His phone pointed out the windshield. Mia sat in the back, her arms crossed tightly. Nothing's happening, Jake muttered. See? Just a dumb story. But then the temperature in the car dropped. The air inside turned sharp and cold. Their breaths puffed out in clouds, and frost crept along the insides of the windows. Is the heater broke? Mia asked, her teeth shattering. Before Jake could answer, Eric gasped, Look! On the side of the road stood a woman in a wedding dress. Her dress was torn and dirty, her veil hanging in tatters. Her pale skin seemed to glow in the moonlight, and her long dark hair clung to her face like wet strings. She wasn't walking. She was standing still, staring directly at their car. Holy crap, Jake whispered. Drive, Mia begged, but Jake hesitated. She's just standing there, he said, gripping the wheel tightly. Then, without a warning, the woman lifted her arm and pointed at the car. The air turned freezing. Frost crawled faster across the window, turning the glass into an icy blur. The temperature dropped so fast that Mia's fingers stung with cold. Go, she screamed. Jake hit the gas, tires spinning on the icy road as the car lurched forward. I think we're okay, Eric said, looking back. Then came the thud. Something heavy hit the roof of the car. What was that? Jake shouted. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound of fingers dragging across the metal echoed from above them. She's on the roof, Mia screamed. Hold on, Jake shouted, swerving hard. The car slid across the road, nearly spinning out before catching traction. The weight shifted, then was gone. She's gone, Eric gasped. But when Jake looked in the rear view mirror, she was standing in the middle of the road. Her head twisted at an unnatural angle, her frozen smile stretched too wide. The frozen bride's eyes locked on Jake, and she started to walk toward them. The car barely made it to the cabin. The friends stumbled inside, shaking from the cold and fear. That wasn't real, Jake kept muttering. That couldn't have been real, but Mia's fingers were still red with frostbite. Her skin dropped from the icy touch of whatever had been outside that car. They barely slept that night. When Mia finally closed her eyes, her dreams turned into nightmares. In her dreams, she was back on the road. The frozen bride stood in the snow, her dead eyes locked on her. You took him from me, the bride whispered in a brittle voice. I didn't, Mia said. He left me, and now you'll pay. The frozen bride's frozen fingers stretched toward her throat, and Mia woke up screaming. The next morning, they decided to leave town early. As they packed their bags, a knock sounded at the door. It was the ranger from the local station. His face was grim. You kids didn't happen to drive down the pass last night, did you? We might have, Jake said, trying to sound casual. The ranger sighed. You're lucky to be here. There's been another death. A man found frozen just off the road. They say his face was twisted like he was trying to scream. Mia's stomach turned. She's still out there, the ranger warned. When the snow falls, she's always out there. Later that evening, as their car sped away from Jackson Hole, Mia stared at the frosty window. Her heart pounded when she saw what looked like a figure in white standing far off in the trees. But when she blinked, the figure was gone, and just faintly, she thought she heard a whisper in the wind. He left me. Now I'll take you. The Wind River Canyon in Wyoming is a beautiful stretch of twisting roads and steep cliffs, but locals know there's something wrong with that place, something dark. Drivers speak of strange lights in the canyon, cars that break down for no reason, and worst of all, the night watcher. They say it's a shadowy figure with glowing red eyes, always watching from the cliffs, and if you see it once, you might not make it home. David, Melissa, and their 12-year-old son Tyler weren't from Wyoming. They were just passing through on a family road trip, heading home from vacation. The sun was setting as they entered Wind River Canyon, the jagged cliffs casting long shadows across the winding road. We should find a place to pull over, Melissa said, rubbing her eyes. There's a rest stop up ahead, David replied, pointing to a faded sign. The parking lot was empty when they pulled in. The air was cold, and the canyon walls seemed to close in around them. I don't like this place, Tyler muttered. It's just a rest stop, David said with a shrug. We'll be out of here in the morning. But Tyler couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That night, Tyler lay in the backseat of the car, tossing and turning in his sleeping bag. The wind howled through the canyon, and the shadows from the cliffs seemed to move when he closed his eyes. Then he saw it. A dark figure stood high on the canyon ridge. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body thin and jagged like twisted branches. Its eyes glowed a deep burning red. Mom, Dad, Tyler whispered, shaking his parents awake. What's wrong? Melissa said. There's someone out there. David groaned and sat up. It's just the wind playing tricks on you. But when he looked out the window, his face paled. The figure was still there, closer now. The glowing red eyes never blinked. Get in the car, David said sharply, starting the engine. The car rumbled to life, and David sped out the rest stop, heading down the winding road. The headlights cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but rocks and shadows. But Tyler kept looking back, and the night watcher was still there. Closer now, it moved without walking, guiding down the rocky cliffs like smoke twisting through the air. Dad, it's following us, Tyler whispered. Dad's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. It's fine, we're getting out of here. The road twisted and turned to the canyon, the same jagged walls towering above them. David kept driving, refusing to slow down. But then they passed the same sign from earlier, the faded one that pointed to the rest stop. Wait, Melissa whispered. Didn't we just... David's face went pale. They were back where they started. That's impossible, he muttered. The headlights flickered. The dashboard lights dimmed. The car was dying. No, 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 David hissed, pumping the gas. The engine sputtered, then stopped. The family sat in silence, the cold air creeping in. Then Tyler saw him, the night watcher, standing just a few yards away. The figure's limbs bent at unnatural angles, and its glowing red eyes burned like coals. It didn't move, but Tyler swore it was closer than before. Don't look at it, David whispered. Just stay quiet. The family huddled in the car, barely breathing. The air seemed to press against the windows, heavy and cold. Minutes passed, maybe hours. Then something scratched against the back of the car. A long scrape. Is that the wind? Melissa whispered. Another scrape, this time against Tyler's window. He turned his head just enough to see. The night watcher's face was right outside, pale skin stretched tight over a skull-like face, its red eyes burning holes into his soul. Its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. Tyler screamed. "Drive!" Melissa screeched. David twisted the keys in the ignition. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. The headlights flickered on, and the night watcher was gone. They tore down the road, tires skidding on the icy pavement. The canyon walls seemed to close in tighter, the shadows growing longer. "I don't know where we're going," David cried. "It's just the same road over and over. Just keep driving," Melissa shouted. The car rounded a bend, and suddenly the road ended. A jagged cliff stretched out before them, with nothing but darkness below. David slammed the brakes. The car skidded and lurched to a stop, inches from the edge. "We're trapped," Melissa whispered. Then they saw him again. The night watcher stood at the edge of the cliff, waiting, watching. His grin stretched wide, and the red eyes glowed brighter. "You're not getting us," David growled, gripping the wheel tightly. Then Tyler spoke, his voice weak and cold. He's not after us." "What?" Melissa asked, turning to him. "He's after someone else." A pair of headlights appeared on the road behind them. Another car, a lone driver heading straight toward the dead-end cliff. The watcher turned away from them and faced the oncoming car instead. "No, no," David whispered. The driver never slowed down, the headlights shone on the night watcher's grinning face just seconds before the car slammed straight into him. Only there was no impact. The car passed through the figure like smoke, then went right over the edge. There was a sickening crunch as the vehicle hit the rocks below, and then silence. The night watcher turned back toward them, those glowing red eyes still burning. He raised one thin, bony arm and pointed directly at Tyler. "We have to go," David said through clenched teeth. He spun the car around and sped back the way they came. This time the road seemed clearer, brighter. Within minutes, they broke free of the canyon. When they looked back, the night watcher was gone. The next morning, news broke of the accident. The driver was never found, just an empty frozen car with the driver's seat belt twisted and torn open, like someone had pulled the driver out. "That thing?" Tyler whispered, staring out the window as they left Wyoming behind. "It wasn't just watching us." Melissa nodded. "It was hunting." Far behind them, deep in the shadows of Wind River Canyon, the night watcher stood once more, waiting, watching, and choosing his next victim. Fort Laramie, Wyoming, a place rich with history, once a bustling military outpost. But for those who know the truth, it's more than just a landmark. It's a graveyard, and something inside refuses to rest. Daniel Hargrove knew all about Fort Laramie's dark past. As a local historian, he spent years studying old letters, war records, and journals, but recently he'd become obsessed with something strange. Visitors kept reporting eerie encounters, footsteps echoing through empty halls, faint whispers in the night, and the most chilling of all, soldiers in tattered uniforms, seen marching near the old parade grounds at dawn. They say it's just superstition. Daniel told his friend Marcus over coffee one morning, but too many people have seen it. Something's going on out there. "Dude," Marcus laughed. "You're seriously scared of ghost stories right now?" "I've been reading old journals from soldiers stationed there," Daniel said, lowering his voice. "One of them talks about a man called the Pale General." Marcus' smile faded. "You don't mess with that stuff, man." "Who was he?" Marcus leaned in. Local legend says he was some twisted commander, obsessed with building an unbeatable army. They say he forced soldiers to stay on duty long after they died. The Pale General's army doesn't bleed, And they never stopped marching. That's ridiculous, Daniel scoffed. Yeah, Marcus muttered. Then why don't you spend the night there and see for yourself? Daniel couldn't resist the challenge. That evening, he parked outside Fort Laramie with his camera and notebook. The site was closed to visitors after dark, but Daniel knew how to slip through a gap in the old fence. The place was cold and silent. The stone walls loomed like dark skeletons against the sky. Crickets chirped faintly in the distance, but otherwise, nothing. Daniel walked quietly through the fort's crumbling quarters. Dust covered the wooden floors, and the air smelled stale. He reached the old barracks, the spot where most of the ghost sightings had been reported. He set up his camera, took a deep breath, and began recording. I'm inside Fort Laramie, Daniel whispered into the camera. It's nearly midnight and everything's quiet for now. Then he heard it. Footsteps, soft at first, like boots scuffling along wood, then louder and closer. Daniel spun around, but the hallway was empty. The footsteps stopped. Hello? Daniel called out, his voice shaking. Is someone here? Then a faint whisper drifted through the air. March, march, march. A cold chill swept over him. His breath fogged the air. Suddenly the sound of drums rolled faintly in the distance, low and steady like a funeral march. And that's when he saw them. Shadowy figures emerged from the darkness, soldiers in torn uniforms, their faces pale and lifeless. Some had gaping wounds, others were missing limbs. They marched in perfect rhythm, their boots thudding against the wooden floor. Leading them was a figure taller than the rest, a skeletal man in a faded uniform, his face sunken and pale like wax melting off of a skull. His hollow eyes burned with a cold, unnatural glow. The pale general. Daniel stumbled back, heart racing. He grabbed his camera and bolted toward the exit. The soldier's footsteps thudded behind him, faster now. The sound of the drum grew louder, deafening. Daniel burst out of the barracks and into the open courtyard, but the ghostly army followed. The pale general stepped forward, his twisted grin stretching wide. You should not be here, the general rasped. His voice was like dry leaves scraping across stone. I'm leaving, Daniel stuttered. You're too late, the general hissed. Once you've seen my army, you march with them. The soldiers began to circle Daniel. Their sunken faces twitched and jerked, their hollow eyes locked on him. No, Daniel screamed. I'm not one of you. The pale general grinned wider. Not yet. Daniel barely remembered escaping. He sprinted back to his car, peeling away from the fort as fast as his tires could grip the icy road. At home, he locked his doors, pulled the curtains shut, and checked his footage. The recording showed everything, the footsteps, the shadows, the glowing eyes of the pale general. But then he noticed something that made his stomach turn. In the final seconds of the video, one of the soldiers wasn't marching with the others. It was standing still, staring directly into the camera. The soldier's face was twisted and gray, and Daniel recognized it. It was his own face. That night, Daniel barely slept, and when he finally drifted off, his dreams were cold and endless. He dreamed he was walking down a dark corridor, his boots thudding in perfect rhythm with the soldiers around him. Ahead, the pale general marched proudly, leading his army forward, and Daniel knew the truth then. He was already one of them. In the distance, a drum began to beat. Duh, duh, duh. Daniel woke in his bed, drenched in sweat. He staggered to the window and looked outside. There, standing beneath the streetlight, was the pale general watching him, and behind him, the twisted shapes of his army were beginning to march. Daniel's body was found days later, still in his room. His face was frozen in a twisted look of terror, his fingers clenched tight like he'd been grasping something or trying to hold something back. No one ever found the footage he recorded, but some say that if you visit Fort Laramie at night, you can still hear the sound of the boots, marching closer and closer. And when the pale general points at you, your name is added to the list.